Between darkness and light, Florence, the birthplace of a new age. Human history has never flowed like a gentle river. It has thrashed, raged, and at times grown so dark that people feared the light would never return. Imagine living in 14th century Europe, a continent fractured by feudal kingdoms, where land was the only wealth, and the Catholic Church held supreme authority over both the material and spiritual lives of its people. A world where knowledge was controlled, creativity constrained, and man was not the center of the universe, but a lowly, sinful creature, forever bowing before God. This was the Middle Ages, often called the Dark Ages. In those days, fear was a habit. People feared death, war, hunger, and even being burned alive for thinking differently. But the greatest fear of all was the fear of one's own thoughts, because thinking, questioning, doubting the dogma was seen as betrayal. And yet, like a seed sprouting in mud in a small corner of Italy, one city dared to breathe differently. A city not large, not backed by military power, not blessed with a colonial empire, but rich in something else: sensitivity, curiosity, and a quiet longing to break free from the thousand-year shadow of religious dominance. That city was called Florence. Florence, or Firenze in Italian, nestled among the Tuscan hills, was neither coastal nor agriculturally rich, but it sat at a key crossroads of European trade. The people of Florence didn't wield swords. They traded goods. They didn't go to war. They picked up pens, chisels, and paintbrushes. And they didn't fight for territorial glory. They pursued the glory of beauty, intellect, and understanding. By the late 13th century, Florence was beginning to transform. A merchant class was rising, building banking systems, trading across Europe, amassing wealth, and with it, nurturing a new nobility, a nobility of the mind and the arts. They were rich not just in money, but in their ability to invest in the soul of humanity. From this very soil, the seeds of the Renaissance began to grow. Renaissance from the French means rebirth. But Florence did not simply resurrect the past. It didn't just revive classical Greek and Roman ideals. Florence reimagined what it meant to be human, no longer merely sinners, no longer servants of the church. In the Florentine vision of the Renaissance, the human being became a free individual with reason, emotion, aesthetic sensibility, and the power to reach the divine not through kneeling, but through knowledge and belief in oneself. It was a radical revolution, but a silent one. No gunfire, no bloodshed, no riots. And yet it shook the very foundations of the old world. Florence was the first city to place man above God in its art, the first to bring ancient philosophy back into libraries and lecture halls, the first to turn art patronage into a noble profession. And it was in Florence that geniuses like Giotto, Dante, Brunelleschi, Donatello, and later Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo emerged not just as artists, but as architects of a new humanity. Why Florence and not Rome, the heart of the ancient empire? Why not Venice, the richest of the city-states? Why not Paris or London? Because Florence had no glorious past to rest on, nor a stable present to make it complacent. Florence was a city perpetually on the edge of war, of famine, of transformation, and it was this instability that forced its people to think differently, live differently, and seek different values. In Florence, people learned to live half in reality, half in idealism. They loved beauty not just to worship it, to understand it. They studied geometry not to calculate trade, but to create depth in a painting. They read Plato not out of fear of hell, but to grasp the soul. They dissected the human body not out of horror, but from a desire to know how we are truly made. A frightened priest once wrote, "In Florence, people are beginning to trust themselves more than they trust God. They believe beauty is sacred and that art can save the soul." And that, in fact, may be the Renaissance's greatest truth. Florence was no fairy tale city. It endured plagues, uprisings, political oppression, and brutal assassinations. But it was also the place where light was refined from darkness, like a diamond cut by pressure. The Renaissance was not born of peace, but of pain, of doubt, and of the belief that we can rise above fate through the power of thought. The people of Florence were not saints. They were full of contradictions, superstitious yet scholarly, prayerful yet inquisitive, ambitious for power yet willing to die for a statue. And in those contradictions, they embodied the essence of being human. And that's what made Florence the cradle of the Renaissance. Today, we often admire the results: grand paintings, majestic domes, timeless poetry. But few see the painful, courageous process behind them, how one city chose the light even when darkness still surrounded it. The Renaissance was not a moment. It was a movement of the human mind, and Florence was where that mind first awakened. In the next chapter, we'll step into the heart of Renaissance Florence, where every street, every family, every artisan's hands played a part in birthing a new age. We'll discover why a family of merchants could change history, why a cathedral dome could inspire scientific thought, and how a single statue of David, made of stone, could come to represent the power of all humankind. The journey of the Renaissance is not just about art, it is a journey back to ourselves. And it all began in Florence, the city of boldness, of beauty, and of belief in the light. When we speak of the Middle Ages, we often picture darkness, war, and the crumbling remnants of the Roman Empire. A divided Europe where the church held absolute authority, land was distributed among the nobility, and ordinary people lived quietly, almost like shadows. A continent suffocating in the mist of fear, superstition, and fate. Yet amid that darkness, Florence emerged as a flicker of light. Not dazzling at first, but steady and persistent, eventually bright enough to guide an entire new era. In the 13th century, Florence was not a center of power. It was merely a small city in Tuscany, central Italy. But Florence had a geographical advantage that few noticed. It stood at the crossroads of trade routes between northern Europe and the Mediterranean. Merchants from Venice, Genoa, France, and the Netherlands all passed through, trading everything from wool and silk to spices and silver. And through trade, Florence learned a precious truth. Exchange is not only about goods, it is also about culture and thought. In an age where war was the primary way to expand influence, Florence chose a different path: commerce and banking. It sounds simple, but that choice fundamentally changed the structure of Florentine society. Instead of power being inherited by noble families, a new class began to rise: wealthy merchants, sharp-minded bankers, and savvy entrepreneurs. They did not inherit power. They built it themselves through intellect and effort. From this, a new philosophy emerged. A person's fate was no longer determined by birth, but by ability and vision. Florence became a vibrant society, full of political conflict and contradiction, but also a place where ideas were tested and debated. While much of Europe remained trapped in rigid dogma, Florence became a city of dialogue, where people argued about ethics, philosophy, and the relationship between humanity, nature, God, and the self. In the late 13th century, a young man named Dante Alighieri wrote an epic that defied everything that came before: the Divine Comedy. It was not just a journey from hell to heaven. It was a spiritual map of a medieval soul moving toward enlightenment. Someone who dared to question, to dream, and to confront the brutal truth of sin, as well as the transcendent beauty of redemption. Most importantly, Dante wrote not in Latin, the language of scholars, but in the local Florentine Italian. That act was revolutionary. Dante declared that the language of ordinary people could tell sacred stories. That opened the door to a new world of art, one where beauty was no longer reserved for the elite, but accessible to all. A few decades after Dante, Florence witnessed another turning point, not in literature, but in architecture. In the early 15th century, the great Cathedral of Florence, Santa Maria del Fiore, remained unfinished. Its massive dome had yet to be constructed. No one knew how to build such a large dome without using wooden scaffolding, which Florence lacked. Renowned architects refused the task. Then a goldsmith, not an engineer, stepped forward. His name was Filippo Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi did more than build a dome. He pioneered a new way of thinking about architecture, combining mathematics, classical Roman engineering, and creative problem-solving to solve one of the greatest technical challenges of his time. The dome of Florence Cathedral, with its sweeping curve and no wooden supports, was a declaration in stone that science, art, and human reason could achieve the miraculous. While other regions feared science as dangerous or heretical, Florence embraced it as a branch of faith. Not an opposition to God, but a deeper pursuit of understanding his world. This was the spirit of the Renaissance taking root, a spirit that placed humanity at the center of the universe. No longer a puppet of destiny, no longer a creature born only to suffer, but a creator, a thinker, someone entitled to explore the beauty of the world and the self. Alongside Brunelleschi, Florence nurtured artists like Donatello, who breathed life into marble. His first statue of David, not the more famous version by Michelangelo, symbolized human courage and freedom. David, the small shepherd who defeated the giant Goliath, was Florence itself. A city without an army, but armed with art. A city without a supreme ruler, but rich with free thought. And behind all these achievements was money. But not just money to spend, money to invest in beauty, in thought, and in the intangible. The Medici family, whom we will explore more deeply later, understood something profound. If you nurture beauty, it will elevate society. Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, sponsored countless artists, poets, and philosophers, not because he was a saint, but because he understood. A city without intellect cannot endure, no matter how wealthy it becomes. In 14th and 15th century Florence, artists were honored, not dismissed. Knowledge was exchanged, not burned. Every church, every square, every sculpture held a fragment of the city's soul. That is why Florence was the first flicker of light in the long night of the Middle Ages. That light did not flare instantly. It was extinguished many times, by war, by internal strife, even by the church. But each time it rekindled stronger, more resilient, and shone farther. It lit the way for a reawakened Italy. It inspired Europe to rediscover the value of human dignity. And it reminds us still, even in the darkest ages, as long as one city preserves the fire of intellect, humanity will not be lost. Florence did not wait for peace to begin its transformation. It transformed amid the chaos. And that is the greatest lesson of all. Every great era begins in a small place, with people who dare to think differently, act boldly, and believe deeply that thought can save the world. The Medici family, patrons of a new era. When we speak of the rise of the Renaissance, we often mention the geniuses, Michelangelo, Leonardo da Vinci, Botticelli. But behind their masterpieces, hidden from the spotlight, stood a quiet yet powerful family. They did not create art, but they made it possible. They did not paint, sculpt, or compose, but they nurtured the world in which beauty could flourish and reach the heights of human achievement. They were the Medici. They were not born nobles. They wore no crown and held no throne. But they possessed something greater, the mindset of those who take control of their destiny. 14th century Florence was a dynamic yet chaotic city. Society was divided into factions, and power shifted hands with dizzying speed. In this turbulent setting, a man named Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, an astute and cautious merchant, began the Medici legacy from a place few noticed: banking. Starting from a small office dealing in currency exchange and lending, Giovanni quickly expanded operations across Europe, from Rome to Venice, from London to Bruges. The Medici Bank became more than a place to store money. It was the financial lifeline of the church, managing vast sums from the Vatican, nobles, and merchants across the continent. But Giovanni's ambition went beyond wealth. He understood that true power does not lie in gold, but in trust. The Medici did not buy influence through force, but by becoming indispensable. In a city where art held sway alongside politics, one of the most effective ways to maintain influence was through patronage. The Medici family understood a timeless truth that many still forget: art cannot survive without those who sustain it. For Giovanni, patronage was also a political strategy. At a time when the church dominated thought and culture, supporting painters, sculptors, and philosophers allowed the Medici to build soft power, shaping taste, influencing imagery, and expressing values through beauty. Giovanni's son, Cosimo de' Medici, later known as Cosimo the Elder, elevated the family's influence even further. Cosimo was a discreet but brilliant political mind. He held no formal title and led no armies, yet he controlled Florence's power structures from behind the scenes. He lived modestly and avoided excess, yet invested heavily in architecture, libraries, and schools. Cosimo understood a vital principle: if you wish to lead Florence, do not lead with fear, lead with admiration. He sponsored artists like Donatello, Fra Angelico, and especially Brunelleschi, who designed the iconic dome of Florence's cathedral. When Cosimo supported artists, he did not merely fund them, he trusted them. He believed that genius needs freedom. He did not dictate styles or subjects. He gave artists the space to envision their own worlds. This rare approach made Florence a place unlike any other, capable of producing limitless masterpieces. But the Medici vision extended far beyond visual arts. They understood that to shape an era, one must also cultivate intellect and spirit. Cosimo founded the Medici Library, one of the first private collections housing thousands of ancient Greek and Roman manuscripts. At a time when the church viewed classical philosophy as dangerous, the Medici preserved and translated it. Works by Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus, once forbidden or lost, were revived, debated, and shared. Florence became a center of classical revival, where thinkers were encouraged not only to worship, but also to question, explore, and reconnect the ancient world with the present. In the next generation, Lorenzo de' Medici, known as Lorenzo the Magnificent, brought the family's legacy to its peak. Lorenzo was more than a political and financial leader. He was a poet, a philosopher, and a passionate lover of the arts. Under Lorenzo, Florence became the birthplace of towering figures. Leonardo da Vinci was patronized by Lorenzo from his youth. Michelangelo was invited to live in Lorenzo's household, where he studied art, sculpture, and philosophy. Sandro Botticelli, painter of the Birth of Venus, flourished under Lorenzo's financial support. To Lorenzo, beauty was not mere ornamentation. It was a spiritual form, a bridge between humanity and the cosmos. He believed that true art could awaken the soul and make society more humane. What made the Medici unique was this: they never forced art to serve power. Instead, they used power to serve art. In doing so, they proved that when authority is guided by virtue, it ceases to be domination, it becomes leadership. For 3 centuries, the Medici family achieved something few ruling houses ever did. They invested not in war, but in the soul of humanity. Of course, the Medici were not saints. They were strategic, sometimes ruthless, and always politically aware. But precisely because they understood the fragility of power, they also recognized that art holds a strength beyond laws and regimes. A statue, a painting, a cathedral can outlast generations of rulers. Today, if you walk through Florence, the presence of the Medici is everywhere. In the soaring domes, the ancient libraries, the palaces, and museums. But their greatest legacy is not material. It is a spirit. The spirit of an age that dared to believe that art, knowledge, and beauty could reshape the destiny of a people, and perhaps the world itself. The soul of the Renaissance. Beneath the magnificent frescoes, the towering domes, and the immortal statues of the Renaissance lies something invisible, yet it defined the entire era. That something is humanism. Without it, art would be mere technique. Without it, science would be cold theory. But when humanist thought was rekindled in Florence, the soul of an entire civilization was reborn. Humanism was not an invention, it was a return. It was a return, a journey back in time to ancient Greece and imperial Rome, where humanity was once seen as the center of the universe, as beings of reason, creativity, and freedom. During the Middle Ages, human life was viewed through a strict lens shaped by divine order. Life was for atonement. Beauty was temptation. The body was flesh, and individual thought was often seen as dangerous. But then in 14th century Florence, a quiet yet powerful awakening began to take root. A new wave of thinkers began to ask a simple but radical question. If man was created by God, why should he not be allowed to think, to create, and to pursue happiness? That single question opened the door to an entire age. And the first to light this flame was a scholar named Francesco Petrarca, known to us as Petrarch. Petrarch was neither a politician nor an artist, but he was the first to seek out forgotten manuscripts, not to worship the past, but to revive the dignity of the human spirit buried within ancient texts. He was captivated by Cicero, the Roman orator who wrote of ethics, politics, and the worth of human life. Petrarch saw that man was not simply a sinner, but a being capable of bettering himself through knowledge and beauty. From those dusty scrolls, the seeds of humanist thought began to grow. Humanism encouraged learning, debate, exploration of the natural world, and above all, the courage to question authority. It restored faith in the idea that fate does not rule us, we rule ourselves. One of the earliest expressions of humanism was education. Florence became not only the home of painters, but of linguists, philosophers, mathematicians, physicians, and engineers. In academies funded by the Medici, subjects such as rhetoric, poetry, ethics, history, and classical philosophy returned to the classroom. This marked a profound shift. Education was no longer just about knowing the scriptures. It became a path to becoming fully human, to understand the world, to empathize, to listen, and to reason. Humanism did not reject religion, but it placed human beings at the center as sacred in their own right. In this spirit, Florentine artists began to paint not only divine saints, but real people, with real emotions, real bodies, and real contradictions. Botticelli painted Venus not as a religious symbol, but as a sensual, dreamy, and vividly human woman. Michelangelo sculpted David not as a mythic hero, but as a young man caught between fear and destiny. Leonardo da Vinci captured the Mona Lisa, not with convention, but with obsession for the unknowable depths of a woman's soul. All of this reflected a new consciousness, that humanity is worthy of art, that human emotion is a noble subject, that to understand a person is to touch the divine. Even science, once feared as a threat to faith, was reframed by humanist thought as a way to deepen our understanding of God's creation. Leonardo did not dissect bodies to rebel against religion, but because he believed that understanding anatomy revealed the miracle of life. Brunelleschi did not build cathedral domes to defy the divine, but to honor the creative power granted to humankind by the divine. This is why Renaissance humanism was not a rebellion. It was an awakening from the darkness of fear, an awakening from shame about the body, an awakening from the belief that we are meaningless shadows in a universe too vast to care. And perhaps most powerfully, humanism brought something greater than knowledge. It brought compassion. Because when we begin to see beauty within ourselves, we also begin to see it in others. When a painter renders a beggar as a figure of quiet dignity, when a poet writes of unfulfilled love as something sacred, it is then that humanity learns to feel through beauty. Perhaps the most enduring gift that humanism gave Florence was a belief that every person is worthy of being seen, known, and lived fully and truly. In a world torn by war, disease, and uncertainty, Florence did not build more walls. They built schools, libraries, studios, philosophical societies, and in doing so, they not only survived, they became a timeless symbol of the soul's rebirth. Humanism was not just the foundation of the Renaissance. It was the flame that lit the eternal questions of the human condition. Who am I? Why do I exist? And how can I live in a way that honors the greatest potential within me? The answers do not lie in doctrine. They lie in David's gaze, in Mona Lisa's smile, in Da Vinci's notebooks, and perhaps within us, if we listen closely enough. When you step into any museum in Florence, you are enveloped by beauty, but it is not a divine, distant, or cold beauty. It is a beauty with veins, with eyes, with sorrow, with desire, and with a soul. Renaissance art in Florence stands as the most vivid testimony to a historical transformation, from rigid religious symbolism to the living heartbeat of human beings. Before the Renaissance, art was a mirror of faith. In Europe before the 14th century, art was heavily dominated by religious symbolism. Humans were not portrayed as themselves, they were icons. The Virgin Mary always bore a sorrowful face. Jesus always looked toward heaven. Saints were depicted without any personal expression. Colors were symbolic, proportions unrealistic, and backgrounds often gilded to emphasize the sacred and otherworldly. Art's purpose was to educate faith, not to express emotion, and so the artists remained nameless. They were tools of God, not individual creators. Then came Florence. It was the first place where artists no longer remained anonymous. They signed their work. They took pride in their own perspectives and emotions. More importantly, they began to see art not merely as an illustration of the scriptures, but as a way to deeply understand the human condition. In Florence, paintings began to breathe. A Madonna holding the infant Christ was no longer a rigid icon, but a real mother, her eyes filled with love, concern, and tenderness. A martyred saint was not just an object of veneration, but a figure of pain, suffering, and earthly agony. Florence made this possible because it was not just a religious city. It was a center of scholarship, science, and humanist thought, and so art began to return to the human. One of the greatest innovations in Florentine art was the use of linear perspective. Before that, medieval paintings were nearly flat, lacking depth, with compressed space and characters that stood out merely by size rather than composition. Then around 1415, architect Filippo Brunelleschi discovered the principles of linear perspective based on mathematics and observation. With it, artists could paint three-dimensional spaces on two-dimensional surfaces, creating astonishing realism. Suddenly, figures in paintings no longer floated in a vague, symbolic realm, but stood in real spaces with depth, structure, light, and shadow. This was not just a technical breakthrough, it was a philosophical shift. This world, the earthly world, was worthy of observation, measurement, and beauty. Even before Brunelleschi, the painter Giotto di Bondone, 1267 to 1337, was already rejecting rigid iconography and choosing to paint real human emotions. In Giotto's works, for the first time, one could see tears on the Virgin's face, feel the sorrow of those who witnessed, see the bowing heads and trembling hands touching a lifeless body as if he were not depicting a holy tale but a human tragedy. After Giotto came Masaccio, who introduced perspective powerfully into painting. His most famous work, The Holy Trinity, is a masterclass in using perspective to create spatial depth, drawing viewers into a sacred scene through a deeply earthly and human experience. By the 15th century, Florentine art reached a radiant peak. Artists no longer confined themselves to religious themes. They became enraptured by the human world. Sandro Botticelli was a prime example. His painting, The Birth of Venus, was a visual revolution. Here was a pagan goddess, nude, sensual, poetic, set in a dreamlike natural setting. There was no church, no religious symbol, only a bold celebration of love, beauty, and life. No other city but Florence could have embraced this at the time, because in Florence, beauty was not seen as opposed to morality. It was the highest expression of the soul. Even desire, when elevated through art, was viewed as a sacred part of being human. Not only painting, but sculpture in Florence began to reflect this shift. Donatello was the first to sculpt a nude David in bronze, sensual and tender. No longer a heroic warrior, but a youth with a complex gaze, both confident and fragile. By the time of Michelangelo, his marble David became not just a masterpiece of art, but a symbol of humanity itself. David, with eyes fixed forward, a body full of life, every muscle carved as if it spoke the language of faith and reason, was no longer a biblical character. He was a human being, in the highest sense of the word. Before Florence, artists were craftsmen working to order, painting by template. But in Florence, the artist became a thinker. They were respected as scholars. Their names were remembered. Their personal vision influenced society at large. Florence transformed art into a domain of creativity and philosophy. And from this transformation arose the very idea of the artistic genius, one who sees beyond their age. Renaissance architecture, the dome of Florence and the spirit of science. There is a structure that not only transformed the face of Florence, but also changed the way people of the Renaissance viewed the world. It was not a painting, it was not a statue, it was a dome, a colossal dome, unprecedented in history, rising into the Italian sky like a declaration carved in stone, a testament to the power of human intellect. It is the dome of the Cathedral of Santa Maria del Fiore, the greatest symbol of Renaissance architecture and the newly born spirit of scientific inquiry. Before the dome existed, Florence was a city waiting for the impossible. The construction of Florence's main cathedral, known as the Duomo, began in the late 13th century. For decades, the cathedral rose magnificently, but one essential part was missing: the dome. The dome they envisioned was to be the largest constructed since ancient Rome, over 45 meters in diameter, with no central support, and no one remembered how to build such a structure. Engineers of the time could not imagine how to construct it. That dome was a dream far beyond the technical limits of the medieval world. Florence had a cathedral without a roof, as if faith had been built, but reason had yet to find a way. Then came a man, a name forever tied to the dome: Filippo Brunelleschi. Brunelleschi was not an architect by training. He was a goldsmith, a sculptor, a clockmaker, and a mechanic. But he had a strange mind, obsessed with beauty and deeply fascinated by mathematics, proportion, and classical engineering. In a competition organized by the Florentine authorities in 1418, Brunelleschi proposed a bold design: a massive dome with no central scaffolding, constructed using an entirely new method that had no precedent. He suggested using two concentric domes, an inner and an outer shell, that would support each other and reduce weight. He invented new pulley systems, lifting devices, and a herringbone brick pattern, all uniquely designed for this one project. The people of Florence didn't fully understand his methods, but they believed in something even greater than an explanation. his unwavering faith in human reason. Construction began in 1420 and lasted 16 years. Brunelleschi worked like a man possessed, not just an architect, but a director of hundreds of workers, overseeing materials and experimenting with new techniques each day. The greatest challenge was the absence of scaffolding high enough to support the dome during construction. Brunelleschi thought differently. He built the dome in a herringbone pattern, with each brick laid slightly angled and leaning into the next, creating a self-supporting structure without temporary supports. No one had seen this before, a self-locking structure based purely on physical principles. He also invented entirely new hoisting machines, using reverse gears, vertical pulleys, and winches, revolutionary feats of engineering for the time. Under Brunelleschi's guidance, Florence did more than just build a dome. It learned to solve problems with science and creativity. In 1436, the dome was completed. All of Florence stood in silence, gazing at the structure that defied the sky, not through miracles, not through divine intervention, but through the power of the human mind. The dome was not just a technical achievement. It was a statement of a new era, one in which people no longer bowed their heads in fear, but raised their eyes to the heavens with understanding. It became the emblem of the Renaissance spirit, the fusion of classical Greco-Roman aesthetics with modern science, the celebration of proportion, geometry, and structural harmony, the shift from a world ruled by divine mystery to one built by human hands. The Dome of Florence was the first architectural work of the Renaissance to use symmetry, the golden ratio, and design based on classical studies. It sparked a wave of architecture grounded in mathematics, logic, and precision, and yet still sublimely beautiful. In the Middle Ages, churches took the Gothic form, pointed, towering, filled with gargoyles and stained glass ablaze with color. But the people of Renaissance Florence no longer wanted to be swallowed by shadow. They sought order, light, simplicity, and harmony. Brunelleschi began a return to the architecture of ancient Rome, like rounded domes, Doric and Corinthian columns, flat roofs, square geometry, and balanced proportions. No more labyrinths, only light and open space. Architecture became philosophy written in stone. A church was not merely a place of prayer, but a space where one could encounter themselves. After Florence's triumph, the ideals of Renaissance architecture spread throughout Italy and then across all of Europe. Architects such as Leon Battista Alberti, Michelangelo, and Palladio carried this new language of design forward, blending the classical with the contemporary. From churches and palaces to libraries and public squares, everything began to bear the mark of rationality and ideal beauty. Living spaces were no longer mere shelters, they became extensions of the mind. Large windows, low walls, natural light, elegant facades, gentle curves, all aimed at a lifestyle that was refined, orderly, and poetic. The Dome of Florence was not just a physical marvel, it marked the turning point toward modern science. For the first time, a structure was fully designed and built based on observation, mathematics, and experimentation. Brunelleschi, a man who never attended a university, became the father of linear perspective, of applied mechanics in construction, and of the very idea of the modern engineer. From him came the lineage that led to Galileo, da Vinci, and Newton, because he laid the foundation for a simple yet revolutionary truth. If you understand the world, you can build what has never existed. The first voices of individual freedom. When the people of Florence looked up at the great dome rising above their city, they didn't just see stone, cement, or engineering. They saw something else. Humanity. A human being who dares to question. A human being who dares to speak their truth. And in Florence, that awakening was not only shaped in stone, brick, and sculpture, but also flowed into words, into poetry, into prose, into the first voices of the individual in European history. Florence was not only the cradle of Renaissance architecture and painting, it was the place where literature broke free from the chains of religion, began to explore the human soul, and for the first time in European history, the individual was written down as a living soul with desires, vulnerability, and freedom. Before the Renaissance, when literature spoke only in the voice of God, Mod, throughout the Middle Ages, European literature was bound tightly to the authority of the Church. The dominant language was Latin, a sacred tongue understood only by the clergy and elite scholars. Its themes revolved around scripture, doctrine, morality tales, and epic heroic songs. The individual barely existed. No one wrote about personal emotions, daily life, or inner conflict because the individual was seen as sinful, lowly, in need of control. Literature functioned as a mirror reflecting God's will, not as a mirror of the human heart. Then Florence changed everything. Dante Alighieri, the first to guide a soul through darkness. In the early 14th century, a name emerged from Florence that would shake the foundations of European literature: Dante Alighieri. With his work, The Divine Comedy, La Divina Commedia, he created not only a poetic masterpiece, but also opened the first doorway for the human soul to enter literature as a distinct individual being. The Divine Comedy follows Dante himself, a lost soul journeying through hell, purgatory, and paradise. Although the setting is religious, the central figure is not God, but a human searching for salvation. Dante openly expresses doubt, fear, and even anger, deeply human emotions portrayed with raw honesty. Most revolutionary of all, he wrote in Italian, the language of the people, instead of Latin. This bold choice made the Divine Comedy the first great national literary work accessible to the public and opened the path for secular literature. Dante was not merely a poet, he laid the foundation for expressing the voice of the individual soul in an age when such voices were often silenced. Petrarch, the sigh of a heart in love. If Dante was the cry of a lost soul, Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch, was the sigh of a heart in love. Petrarch fell in love with a woman named Laura, an unattainable, unrequited love. From this pain, he wrote hundreds of sonnets, each one a delicate slice of the heart. No pleas for divine grace, no praise for saints, just a man in love, in suffering, in longing, alive. For Petrarch, love was no longer a sin as once taught by religious doctrine. Love became a profound spiritual experience, a way for the individual to feel the world through their own emotions. He was also among the first to rediscover ancient Roman texts, finding humanist wisdom in the writings of Cicero, Seneca, and Ovid. From these pages, Petrarch redrew the image of humanity, no longer merely servants of God, but sentient beings who could think, feel, and love. Boccaccio, when everyday life became literature, among the three pillars of early Florentine Renaissance literature: Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio. Giovanni Boccaccio was the one who brought real daily life into literature. His greatest work, the Decameron, is a collection of 100 stories told by 10 nobles taking refuge in a villa while the Black Death ravaged Florence. What makes the Decameron extraordinary is not only that it captured a harrowing historical moment, it portrayed ordinary life with a tone that was natural, humorous, and deeply human. Boccaccio did not shy away from themes like sex, desire, deceit, cleverness, joy, disappointment. He transformed everyday tales into literature, and by doing so gave ordinary people a rightful place in the world of letters. Not saints, not kings, but merchants, prostitutes, cunning priests, all had the right to be told, to exist, to be part of a living society. Linguistic freedom, when literature left its ivory tower. All three major Florentine authors, Dante, Petrarch, and Boccaccio, chose to write in Italian rather than Latin. They chose the language of the people, of the town square, of everyday life. By doing so, they gave the power of language to the public. Literature no longer lived only in monasteries, but in marketplaces, inns, kitchens, and in every lover's sigh. Using the vernacular made Florentine literature the first truly public literature of modern Europe. That was a turning point. When people can speak in their native tongue, they begin to think for themselves. Florentine literature, a mirror of self-awareness. What made Florentine literature unique was not just its technique, structure, or language. It was how it saw the human being. For the first time in medieval European history, literature stopped instructing people on how to live to reach heaven and began helping them understand themselves, right here on earth. Fear, longing, love, loneliness, betrayal, dreams. All the things that make us human were written about with honesty, without sermon, without condemnation. And so the self awakened for the first time, not to boast, but simply to exist, to say, I am here, I am alive, I have a story. A legacy for the modern world. Florentine literature did not influence only Italy. It shaped a new model for all Western literature, writing in the language of the people, exploring the inner life of the individual, emphasizing secular as real-world experience, freedom in style and tone. From Shakespeare in England to Cervantes in Spain to Montaigne in France, all were shaped by Florence. It is no coincidence that as the Renaissance spread, literature moved hand in hand with personal awakening. When thinking moved beyond the church. There is something few people notice. The Renaissance was not only a time of paintings, sculptures, or magnificent domes. It was also the age when humans began to look up at the sky, not to find God, but to discover laws. They looked into the human body, not to examine whether the soul was pure, but to understand how blood flows, how the heart beats, how the brain operates in the darkness of the skull. The Renaissance was when people began to ask questions and no longer waited for the church to answer. For the first time in thousands of years, they said, "I want to know, not to defy God, but to understand the world he created." And Florence, always Florence, remained the cradle of birth. Not only for beauty, but for independent thought. During the Middle Ages, the study of science was tightly bound to theology. Every question had to be answered through Scripture. The sun rose because God willed it, rain fell because he commanded it. Logic, experimentation, and reason were viewed with suspicion. Those who questioned dogma risked being labeled heretics, sometimes burned at the stake. But in the 14th and 15th centuries, in Florence, as people began to rediscover themselves through art and literature, something natural occurred. They began to question what had long been considered unchangeable. That doubt, at first, was not rebellious. It simply asked, "I want to understand better." And from that humble desire, modern science was quietly born. No one embodied that spirit of inquiry more than Leonardo da Vinci. He was a painter, engineer, architect, anatomist, astronomer, inventor, and above all, a relentless questioner. Leonardo painted the Last Supper, painted the Mona Lisa, and at the same time, he dissected corpses to draw every muscle, every artery. Not to challenge the church, but because he believed that to understand the body was to understand God in a deeper sense. His notebooks, thousands of pages, recorded studies of water flow, the principles of flight, the anatomy of the eye, designs for tanks, revolving bridges, and parachutes. No church directed Leonardo. His thinking was a solitary journey, guided by observation, experimentation, and intuition. He once wrote, "Science is the master of all disciplines. It teaches us that to see clearly, one must look with their own eyes." Why was Leonardo able to live and work this way? Part of the answer lies in Florence, the only city at that time not completely under the church's control. Under the leadership of the Medici family, especially Cosimo and Lorenzo, a culture of intellectual freedom was fostered. Rational thought was honored. Debate was welcomed. In Florence, men like Leonardo Brunelleschi and Marsilio Ficino were not condemned as heretics for asking questions. On the contrary, they were respected. Because the Florentines understood, only when people think freely can a city truly become great. This created a precedent never before seen in European history. Science was no longer confined to monasteries. It was discussed in piazzas, palaces, and even in artist workshops. Florence witnessed a wave of rediscovery and advancement in fields such as mathematics. Fibonacci, the mathematician from Pisa, just outside Florence, introduced the Fibonacci sequence and the Hindu-Arabic numeral system to Europe. Thanks to this, Renaissance artists could calculate perspective, architects could measure mass, and merchants could keep accounts. Anatomy. Like Leonardo, many scholars began to dissect actual bodies to study biological structures. This was taboo in most of Europe, but tacitly permitted in Florence. Astronomy. Early ideas of heliocentrism, later advanced by Copernicus and Galileo, began with the spirit of skepticism born in Renaissance Italy. Cartography and geography. The discovery of the New World at the end of the 15th century prompted Europeans to create accurate maps, no longer based on biblical legends, but on real-world observation. Truth began to be sought through the tools of reason, not just the voice of sermons. Florence didn't just advance technical science, it revived classical philosophy as well. Among the most important was Marsilio Ficino, head of the Platonic Academy in Florence, funded by Lorenzo de' Medici. Ficino did not reject God, but he believed that humans could approach truth through reason, not only through faith. He retranslated the works of Plato, Plotinus, and others, and proposed that human beings are part of a harmonious universe. When we understand the world, we are understanding ourselves and understanding the divine. This was a turning point for European intellectuals. Knowledge was no longer seen as a threat to faith, but as a bridge toward deeper meaning. In Florence, science and art were not separate. An artist needed mathematics to draw proper perspective. An engineer needed beauty to design a graceful bridge. A philosopher needed inspiration to write truth. There was no boundary between the painter and the researcher. Leonardo embodied all these roles, and he was not alone. Another example was architect Brunelleschi, designer of Florence's Grand Dome, who applied principles of mechanics and calculus not yet formally defined. Yet he was no professional mathematician. He was a craftsman, a thinker, an experimenter, true to the Renaissance spirit. In the Middle Ages, power came from divine right and the sword. But in the Renaissance, a new power quietly rose: knowledge. Florentines began to believe, the deeper your understanding, the stronger you become. The more clearly you can explain the world, the more capable you are of transforming it. Libraries sprung up across Florence. Books were no longer the privilege of priests, but became the tools of merchants, artists, and scholars. Florence gave the world a priceless lesson. There is nothing more powerful than a mind that thinks and a hand that dares to act. From Florence to the world, the spread of light. In a fleeting moment of history, Florence burned like a brilliant torch in the dark night of the Middle Ages. But what is most remarkable is not that this light flared up. It is that it did not fade. It spread. It moved through the cobblestone paths of Italy, across the frozen Alps, over the English Channel, and into distant kingdoms. It transformed an entire continent. From Florence, the Renaissance ceased to be a local phenomenon. It became a revolution of ideas across Europe. A quiet yet enduring uprising, fueled not by swords, but by intellect, by art, and by the spirit of discovery. A path of transmission, from artists to scholars, from merchants to monarchs. The Renaissance did not spread like an armed rebellion. It conquered not through violence, but through inspiration. Artists like Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Botticelli left Florence with a new vision of humanity, beauty, and expressive freedom. They traveled to Rome, Milan, Venice, and then beyond Italy to France, Spain, and Germany. Florentine merchants with vast trade networks transported not only goods, but books, paintings, and ideas. For the first time, thanks to Gutenberg's printing press, scholars could replicate knowledge in thousands of copies. No longer confined to handwritten manuscripts in monasteries, Florence had knowledge. Now the world had a way to share it. Leonardo in France, a flame on foreign soil. In 1516, Leonardo da Vinci, the towering genius of Florence, was invited to France by King Francis I. In his final years, he brought with him manuscripts, sketches, and the now iconic Mona Lisa. At the Château du Clos Lucé, Leonardo was no longer merely a painter. He became a living symbol of Renaissance intellect. He designed canals, advised on architecture, discussed philosophy, and planted the seeds of Florence in French soil. Upon Leonardo's death, Francis I remarked, "There has never been another man born into the world who knew as much as he did." Thanks to Leonardo and others like him, France entered its own Renaissance. It was marked by thinkers like Jean Clouet, Rabelais, and Montaigne. Rome, where even the church embraced new art. Rome, the stronghold of papal power, was once fiercely conservative, but even it could not resist the allure of Florentine innovation. Popes Julius II and Leo X, who came from the Medici family, summoned Michelangelo, Raphael, and Bramante to Rome. They came not to preserve tradition, but to renew the Church's majesty through Renaissance art. What was born in Florence, perspective, expression, humanism, architectural ambition, entered the Vatican and became the sacred language of spiritual authority. The Sistine Chapel, with Michelangelo's ceiling, stands as proof. The human form was now worthy of sharing space with the divine. Northern Europe, where light met faith. When the Renaissance reached the north, in places like the Netherlands, Germany, and England, it encountered deeply rooted religious culture. Instead of extinguishing the light, faith in these regions transformed it in their own way. In Germany, Albrecht Dürer blended woodcut technique with Italian artistry. He brought the human figure and nature into sacred themes. In the Netherlands, Jan van Eyck and the Flemish masters captured everyday life with unmatched subtlety. It was a practical and grounded form of humanism. In England, Thomas More wrote Utopia, and Shakespeare created the most humanistic plays in history. All were rooted in the spirit born in Florence. The Northern Renaissance was less flamboyant but deeper and more introspective. If Florence taught humanity to look outward, the North taught it to look within. Simultaneous shifts from Renaissance to Reformation. As the light of Florence spread, it ignited long-standing tensions. These included the overreach of the church, the illiteracy of the populace, and the stagnation of theological dogma. The result was another upheaval that unfolded alongside the Renaissance. This was the Protestant Reformation. Martin Luther, a German theologian, asked a radical question. If people possess reason and the capacity to commune directly with God, why is a pope needed as an intermediary? Although different in purpose, both the Renaissance and the Reformation were about the same claim. They demanded the right to think freely. That demand first rose in Florence, the city that taught people how to question. Florentine seeds in the New World. While Europe was transforming, Florence also helped spark another grand journey, the discovery of new worlds. New maps, printing techniques, and scientific thinking, developed in or inspired by Renaissance Italy, enabled explorers like Columbus, Magellan, and Vespucci to cross oceans. What Florence gave to the world was curiosity, confidence in reason, and a hunger for knowledge. These became the spiritual foundation of the Age of Discovery. The light of the Renaissance did not stop at Europe's shores. It crossed the seas and continues to illuminate lands once unknown. Enduring influence, foundations of the modern world. Looking back, it becomes clear. The Renaissance was not a passing trend. It was the seismic shift that reshaped the Western world. Modern politics stems from the Renaissance ideal of individual liberty. Modern art traces back to Florentine techniques of perspective and expression. Modern science began with the doubt, observation, and experimentation encouraged by Florentine thinkers. Modern education is grounded in the humanist belief that everyone deserves access to knowledge. Florence was the first spark in this chain reaction. Why Florence and not elsewhere? The question still lingers. Why did it all begin in Florence? The answer lies not merely in economics, politics, or geography. Florence was different because it believed in human potential. It allowed intellect to roam freely. It protected artists, scholars, and even those who were considered unorthodox. While others feared the shadow of heresy, Florence lit a lamp, and when that lamp burned bright, others found their way toward the light. Conclusion: light belongs to no one alone. Although the Renaissance began in Florence, its light no longer belongs to one city. It is a spirit that lives wherever people dare to ask questions. Today, whether we sit in classrooms, visit museums, read books, create art, write essays, or explore the stars, we continue the journey that Florence once began. Light that is born of courage and intellect can never truly be extinguished. Florence and its lessons for humanity today. Florence is a small city on the map of Italy, yet it carries the weight of an entire era. Throughout the journey we have just walked together, from its proud domes to its vivid paintings, from its philosophers to its scientists, from the cradle of humanism to the light that spread across Europe, Florence did not merely awaken a glorious age. It left behind a legacy that time could never bury. And today, standing amidst a modern world of upheaval, crisis, isolation, and the quiet confusion of the human soul, the legacy of the Renaissance from Florence still whispers lessons. These are not lessons only for the pages of history, but for each individual, each society, each age. Human beings at the center, not to be glorified, but to be awakened. The humanist philosophy of the Renaissance did not proclaim that humans are inherently great. It declared that humans have the potential to become great. It reminds us that within each person lies the capacity to reflect, to create, to transcend if we dare to believe. In a world saturated with technology and information, Florence calls us back to our roots. We are not merely data points or instruments, but beings of emotion, reason, and dignity. This is the most fundamental lesson, and also the one most easily forgotten. Freedom is not something given, but something we must fight for. The Renaissance did not sprout from favorable conditions. It was born in a Europe gripped by theocracy, war, and poverty. Yet the people of Florence, from painters to merchants, from architects to writers, did not wait for the times to change. They created the change. The lesson for us today is that freedom of thought, freedom of creation, and freedom of expression are never gifts. They are the result of courage and perseverance. Whenever you dare to live true to your thoughts and feelings, you carry forward the spirit of Florence. The patronage of beauty is a responsibility of both power and community. The Medici family once patronized the arts not only for glory, but because they believed in the power of beauty to heal, to unite, and to uplift society. In an age where economic value seems to overshadow all else, Florence poses a difficult question. Who will be the patrons of beauty today? Governments, corporations, communities, or each of us? The presence of art, education, and knowledge does not arrive by accident. It must be protected, invested in, nurtured. If we forget, the light will fade, not because no one carried it forward, but because no one cared to keep it burning. When crisis strikes, learn to be reborn like Florence. Did you know? Before entering its renaissance, Florence endured deep economic crises, deadly plagues, and internal strife. But instead of collapsing, the city chose to rebuild from within through culture, through art, through education. It was not a short-term decision, but it was a sustainable one. In these uncertain times marked by pandemics, conflict, climate upheaval, and social fragmentation, Florence whispers to us, rebirth does not mean restoring the old, but building something deeper and more noble. Knowledge is a guiding light, but humility keeps us grounded. The Renaissance was not about unchecked individual ego. It was a fusion of independent thought and humble learning. Florentine scholars revisited Aristotle, Plato, and classical works of Greece and Rome, not to reject history, but to build a new future. Today, with artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and big data opening unprecedented frontiers, Florence teaches us that the more we know, the more we must remain humble. There are no absolute answers, only an endless journey toward truth. Beauty is not a luxury, but a spiritual necessity. In today's consumerist society, beauty is often pushed to the margins as decoration, as something optional. Florence said the opposite. Beauty is essential to life. A sculpture, a melody, a painting, or simply a sunlit dome can lift a soul, awaken a dream, or heal a wound. Without beauty, we are merely walking husks. Florence reminds us that when we live in an environment that honors beauty, we live more deeply, more kindly, and more humanely. Do not fear time. Live in a way that leaves a mark. Leonardo did not paint to be revered. Michelangelo did not sculpt to become a monument. They simply lived fully for their work, their passion, and for questions with no guaranteed answers. Yet it was precisely that spirit which left its mark not just on stone, but in the hearts of humankind. Today, when the world spins too fast, when everything demands instant results and efficiency, Florence gently urges us to slow down. Go deeper. Do something with soul. What truly endures is not the echo. It is what touches the soul of another. Every individual can be a center of renaissance if you dare. Florence was not a miracle that fell from the sky. It was the resonance of hundreds and thousands of people, each daring to think, to act, to ask. You don't have to be Leonardo or Michelangelo. You only need to be honest with yourself, to live with passion, and to keep learning. Every time you do, a piece of Florence awakens once more. Florence is not in Italy. It is wherever someone dares to live as if the world could be more beautiful and more just. An immortal legacy is held not in museums, but in the hearts of those who live meaningfully. Today, Florence may be a tourist destination or a name in textbooks, but its true legacy is not in monuments or cathedrals. It is in every choice we make. When we choose kindness over judgment, when we read a book instead of scrolling endlessly, when we stand up for what is right, when we create something beautiful, however small, in our own world. Each of these is another petal added to humanity's Renaissance garden. When history is not just the past, but a call from the heart. Perhaps after 9 chapters of this journey, we have come to see that Florence is no longer just ancient brick walls, not merely the majestic dome of Brunelleschi or the sublime paintings of Botticelli. Florence is no longer just a point on the map of Italy. It is a way of being, an eternal invitation for those who long to understand themselves and humanity. The Renaissance is not a chapter closed and buried under the dust of history. It is the echo of souls who dared to look at the world with both heart and intellect, who dared to believe that human beings are not born to bow their heads but to rise, to ask questions, to create light even in the darkness. And you, the one listening to these words, you are not outside that current. You are a part of the next Renaissance. Each time you pause in the frantic rhythm of life to truly see a work of art, each time you quietly listen to the music rising from within, write a few words, or ask yourself, who am I? You are continuing Florence. Every time you choose truth instead of silence, knowledge instead of ignorance, beauty instead of convenience, you are living as a modern-day Florentine. You may not hold Leonardo's brush or carry Dante's symphonies in your soul, but you possess what Florence always cherished most, a soul that feels, a mind that opens, and a heart brave enough not to surrender. Florence is a source. Its light only truly lives when it is passed on. So when this video ends, do not close Florence like an old storybook. Carry it with you. Let it live in the way you live, the way you love, the way you think, the way you pass on hope. And perhaps someday in the future, someone just like you today will stand before a new gate of Florence, not in Italy, but within their own heart. There, beauty will be born once more.